Okay. I now declare open the public hearing of the Standing Committee on Education's inquiry into the factors driving educational attainment. I acknowledge the traditional custodians, the lands from which we all meet today, and pay my respects to elders past and present and of the Indigenous peoples all across Australia. This hearing will be broadcast and the transcript of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. I now invite members of the committee to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Sam Beryl, member for Nichols in Northern Victoria and Shadow Assistant Minister for Regional Education.
G'day all, I'm Dan Repicoli, Federal Member for Hunter.
Kate Chaney, Independent Member for Curtin in Western Australia.
Soon the member for Banks in southwestern Sydney.
We have Ms. Coffey on the line as well, but might be on mute. Okay, I know we've got Ms. Coffey on the line, but I'll ask now if I can welcome representatives from the Department of Education to give evidence. For the benefit of the Hansard, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee?
Hi, I'm Dan Donegan. I'm the First Assistant Secretary for Improving Student Outcomes Division in the Schools Group of the Department of Education.
Leslie O'Donoghue. I'm the Assistant Secretary within the Schools Assessment, Measurement and Research Branch within the National Reform Division in Schools Group.
Hi, I'm Mel Southwell-Lee. I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Curriculum and Learning Branch in the Teaching and Learning Division of Schools Group.
Hi, I'm Fleur de Crepney. I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Market Analysis and Data Branch within the Higher Education Research and International Group, the Department of Education.
Hi, I'm Daniel Frewer. I'm the Acting Assistant Secretary of the Funding and Outcomes Branch in the Higher Education Research and International Group of the Department of Education.
Good morning, my name is Madonna Moulton. I'm the First Assistant Secretary of the Programs and Student Experience Division in the Higher Education Research and International Group.
And good morning, my name is Brett Nordstrom. I'm Assistant Secretary of Higher Education Program Delivery inside Programs and Student Experience Division.
Thank you all, and thank you for the strong and high-level representation from the Department of Education at this hearing. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and has the same standing as proceedings of the House. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Do you wish to make an opening statement before we proceed to discussion?
No.
No, thank you.
Very good, thank you. Well, I might lead off the questioning before handing to my colleagues. Can I start at the highest possible level for this inquiry? The aim for this inquiry is to build a clearer understanding of what drives educational attainment and where targeted improvements could make the greatest difference. But many submissions have challenged the definition of educational attainment. Some submissions have argued that there's a tension between traditional measures of educational attainment like school attendance and national learning outcomes and other less tangible measures like school readiness and social wellbeing. So to get everyone on the same page from the outset, can I ask how the department considers and defines educational attainment and ask about this tension that's come through in the submissions around different ways of conceptualising attainment between the department and other organisations?
Thank you. So I think educational attainment is a complex and varied measure for students. In the schools environment, we measure education by being able to build a better future for all students. We recognise that all students should be safe and supported to achieve positive learning outcomes regardless of gender. There are some elements that are easier to measure than others, and in a measurement sense, we look to things like attendance and outcomes. However, we also know that attendance is also influenced by factors of feeling safety, being respected, gender equality, being free from being bullied. And so there are actions under the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement that cover all of those elements. So the Department of Education takes a multi-pronged lens. It doesn't look through just one element, and I think that is reflected in the submissions that you've received.
Yeah, and just to add to Ms Donegan's commentary there, the Department of Education's submission that it made recognised the different views, I think on page 3 and page 4, and made reference to how it defines educational attainment, which talks about it being a cumulative and interconnected lifelong journey. And that's based on definitions that are quite consistent with the OECD and the Productivity Commission as well, which sort of explains why you've got broad representation from the department here today across early childhood, schooling and higher education as well. So I hope that assists Committee Chair. I've promoted you there. There you go. And at the bottom, at the bottom of page 3, it does talk about how attainment is cumulative and shaped by early outcomes and interventions, and that those that fall behind early on, as committee members would be well aware, it can take a lot to catch up. It does also talk there about the differences between gender and also between cohorts in how they learn as well, and I think we'd be happy to elaborate on that to the committee as we proceed through the questioning.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge Ms Coffey has joined the call. So to that end, can I ask what data specifically does the department use as a sign or an indicator that a student might be falling behind, as you indicated there? Do these kind of measures of educational attainment change through schooling? So, for example, what does a student that might be falling behind look like in ECEC compared to primary, secondary and post-secondary education?
Thanks, Chair. As Ms Morton said, we are represented by the almost full areas. We don't have anyone from early childhood here today, but we'll start with schools and we'll tell you the different types of things that we measure there, and then we'll go to higher education.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Chair. Just to add on from Ms Donegan's opening remarks, so all Australian governments have actually agreed to uphold the vision of Australian schooling as outlined in the Alice Springs or the Zimbabwe Education Declaration, which was done a couple of years ago as well. That really sort of looks at what does a world-class education system look like, and encourages and supports every student to be the best that they can, no matter where they live and what kind of learning challenges they face as well. So within the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement that was negotiated and finalised in 2025, the agreement actually supports the Zimbabwe Declaration and looking at to the likes of excellence and equity, but also looking at how do we actually build young Australians to become confident, creative individuals, successful lifelong learners, and active and informed members of the community. So that's the premise of where we actually sit. So in terms of some of the education indicators, those indicators are actually within the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement that actually articulate equity and excellence. So there's a component there around NAPLAN, which is for years 3, 5, 7 and 9 across 5 domains, which is numeracy, reading, writing, spelling and grammar and punctuation. That happens on an annual basis, and report is for 2026 will come out in the next couple of weeks, and you may want to actually ask ACARA, who's coming after us, with regards to their further information about that. So there's a national report, and then on the national circumstances around the outcomes of NAPLAN across 3, 5, 7 and 9, across those 5 domains. But there's also jurisdictional reports as well that you can actually delve deeper into what's happening in each jurisdiction. And then there's also a disaggregation of information around priority equity cohorts in terms of First Nations, regional remote, and also with regards to parental educational background as well. And then there's also individual student reports that come out generally in term 3 of each year following NAPLAN, and they are reported directly to the parent or the carer to actually provide them with how their children or their child is actually performing with regards to NAPLAN. And you might have actually seen a couple of those individual student reports come out over the last couple of weeks for individual students there as well. They are driven and they're provided by the individual school and the individual school system as well. Moving on, we've also got a fair bit of information that is contained, public information that is contained in the national report on schooling, and that is housed on the ACARA website. Within that area, there's attendance rates for the likes of primary school, secondary school there as well, and that's also disaggregated by a range of priority equity cohorts. There's also a fair bit of measures around the likes of achievement. So whether that be Year 12 certification for kids actually finishing school and getting a high school certificate or a senior school certificate to actually provide that as well. And there's also information around apparent retention rates. How many kids are actually staying on in school for the likes of their first year of high school all the way to Year 12 as well. So there's a fair bit of information, and that's also broken down by those priority equity cohorts that are in there as well. On the 24th of March, Minister Clare actually provided a BAFSA progress report, a Better and Fairer Agreement progress report, and tabled that in Parliament there. That also outlined some of the green shoots around what's happening in terms of performance as well. So we can actually flag that there's a fair bit of information in that report as well that provides a status of how the reforms are actually working, what's working well, and various case studies across the country using individual systems and also the independent schools and the Catholic systems as well.
I might also just draw the committee's attention to, in early childhood, of course, there is the Australian Early Development Census, which is a national measure that looks at children coming into their first year of schooling and assesses them on a range of domains. I think there's something like 5 domains. And the department's submission refers to the fact that the proportion of children who are considered to be developmentally vulnerable on 2 or more of the domains has grown. It's at 12.5% in 2024. So that's an important national measure that kind of gives us a bit of a starting position on that critical transition from early childhood into schooling and that concept of school readiness, that the focus of early childhood education and care around play-based learning and educational kind of preparedness for schooling in early childhood settings, why that's been such a focus of this government and state and territory governments as well. So that children, when they start to enter into year 1, have a bit of an understanding of how to formulate words, how to count, which comes obviously through the play-based learning and the national curriculum in early childhood education that operates. But I might let Mr. Dr. de Crepnay talk about the higher education landscape.
Thank you, Ms Morton. Yes, in higher education, the Department of Education collects quite a broad range of data about students undertaking higher education courses. We collect information about their applications and offers to study higher education, as well as very detailed information about the students and the courses, units of study, measures of success, completion, attrition, as well as sort of demographic and other information about students, so we can understand, how some of the different cohorts of students fare. We also, in the higher education area, use Australian Bureau of Statistics data. So some of the surveys they conduct contain questions asking about highest education attainment. For example, in the census, there will be a question about highest education attainment, which gives us a very good indicator of what attainment is looking like across the country. There are a number of other surveys, or at least there have been, surveys run by the ABS that shed a bit more detail and information on education attainment and qualifications that people in Australia have obtained. I think it's important to remember that the higher education collections, are good at reporting on students who undertake education in Australia, but we have also people in our community who have obtained qualifications overseas or through other, overseas is the main area, of course, that might not be captured in our data. So we use a variety of sources to understand attainment, as well as understand how the sector is going and how students are tracking through the system.
Thank you. I just want to let members know that Mr. O'Brien has joined the committee hearing on the phone. Can you hear me, Lou? He's on the line. You there, mate? He's juggling Bluetooth. Might just give the call now to Ms. Coffey.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you for the information you've shared so far, and also for your submission. I just wanted to ask for a little bit more information about the learners with disability and additional needs that were discussed in your submission. In particular, do you have an understanding of what percentage of those children or percentage of children in the education system who have speech and language disorders, things like dyslexia or developmental language disorder or apraxia? And secondly, do you have an understanding of how different states and territories manage the use of allied health professionals like speech pathologists to support children enrolled at their schools? I'd be thankful for any more information on that.
Sure, thanks, Member. So I don't have the precise details with me on hand, especially around specific learning disabilities. What I can tell you, though, is that information is collected through our nationally consistent collection of data on school students with a disability. That data does provide some level of type of disability, but sometimes they are aggregated, and so you don't see specific disabilities within that. We would be able to have a look at that data and see if there's anything that we can provide that answers your question more directly. I can say, though, that the students with a disability funding is measured through an annual collection of that data set, the NCCD, that there is $33.3 billion worth of recurring funding that goes to students with a disability. That funding goes to states and to non-government schools. States distribute it to their schools. There are many things that a school can do as an adjustment for a student, and so it will depend on the level of disability that is rated within the NCCD. But for example, all adjustments need to be made for a particular student. So that there is an individualised response for that adjustment, and that adjustment will of course depend on their disability and their functional impairment in that school. So it will depend, I guess, not just on the specific type of disability, but also how you as a student engages with that school. For many schools, yes, they do have referrals to speech pathologists, OTs, nurses. They're all things that are available. Of course, it does depend on where a student is. Sometimes in more regional or remote areas, access to speech pathology or any type of specific healthcare can be more difficult. But schools will do what they can to make sure that there is that specific support available for the student that needs it in their school environment.
I might add the higher education perspective if that's okay and helpful. I think you also mentioned reference to speech pathologists, and Ms Donegan's reflected on that. Of course, the Australian government just announced about a week ago that it would extend the Commonwealth prac payment to a further 10 disciplines in allied health, and speech pathology is one of those. That should be a factor, not necessarily the factor, but a factor in hopefully removing a barrier to some people taking on that, studying that profession and discipline at university. Certainly we've sort of seen in the first round of the CPP, that was for nurses, teachers, midwives and social workers, that has created a bit of an uptick. So we'll be interested to see the results of that. It's also, in terms of the higher education population, students with disability who are identified in our data collections, about 12%. We do run a number of programs that help support those students and staff at universities who identify as having a disability. We have a disability support program, which is the major program. It has 3 elements. It has a disability support fund that the government quadrupled the funding for, and that essentially provides an enrolment-based grant amount to universities for them to use in supporting students who enrol with them who have a disability. There's also a high needs component as well, which is a specific amount to help with kind of claims around equipment and physical supports for students with a disability. We also have funding that goes to Curtin University through the Capacity Building Fund, and one of the pieces of work that Curtin was doing, which is delivered by the Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success, is around doing a stocktake of what is the kind of disability that needs support out in university, so not making an assumption about what's needed and what's not needed. And then also there is the University of Tasmania that receives funding for the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on education and training, and the acronym we use for that is ADSET, and that actually provides specific tools and resources and guidance for practitioners in universities about if they do have someone presenting with a disability, in particular around speech, what are some of the things that they can look to draw on. And that's a very popular resource because it's developed by practitioners for practitioners in the university sector. Might stop there.
I might just add that in the higher education student statistics collection, we do collect information on type of disabilities. So whilst I don't have the data to hand at the moment, it would be possible to take a look at the different types of the breakdown of the different disability types. Like Ms Donegan said, there will be a level of aggregation there that it may not be always possible to identify very specific disability types, but as a general rule, we can see useful categories of disabilities. Yeah.
I would be thankful for that, in particular for for primary schools, and I know the higher education information will be very interesting. I just think in terms of disabilities and students with additional needs, when we're looking at early intervention in speech and language disorders, I do just question if that work can be done early, what that can mean for those young people and their educational attainment later on. So I'd be really keen for any information. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Burrell.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you for appearing before us. Some of the data shows that there are some challenges in relation to the gender, specific to gender, in relation to developmentally. Boys are more likely to be developmentally vulnerable on some of the A, E, D, C domains, and the girls are consistently outperforming boys in literacy. I know that's different for numeracy. Could I just ask your view on that and where things are trending? And as a sort of a supplementary question to that, the data that I've looked at indicates we've probably got 70% of all teachers in schools as female. Is that correct? And do you measure that? Is it trending a certain way? And are you considering any programs or initiatives to encourage more males into the teaching profession?
So just on the second question first, I don't have the actual breakdown of gender for teachers and the trending of that and the levels of programs with regards to a focus on gender for recruitment retention of teachers. So we'll have to come back to you on that one. Just on the first question around what is the general trends, which as you outlined already, what we're seeing in sort of literacy and numeracy is that generally boys perform better than girls in numeracy, and that's reflected in historical patterns within NAPLAN. So in terms of from 2008 to the likes of 2025. In addition, we're also seeing girls perform better than boys in literacy domains. So that's your writing, your reading, your spelling, your grammar and punctuation. And again, that's a similar pattern that we have seen since the start of NAPLAN in 2008. But also just noting that Australia is not actually alone in this trend. What we're also seeing is that other countries such as Canada, Singapore, the United Kingdom also experience similar results for boys and girls. What we're also seeing is that if you look at a couple of the international assessments, so the likes of the Program for International Student Assessment, so PISA, which is really looking at an assessment every 3 to 4 years for 15-year-olds and looking at the likes of their mathematics, their science, and also their reading and their assessments around that. And again, using the OECD, because the OECD actually performs this assessment, the trends that we're seeing across the board is that, again, boys are actually doing better in mathematics. Girls are doing better in reading, but we're also seeing that in science, it's a bit of a mixed result. So there's no real difference between boys and girls' achievement levels within science. So, and then we're also looking at, in terms of how much is the divide occurring across the PISA scales. And I would also look at the likes of the PISA report that happened, that provided in 2022, that outlined in a very clear way in the international report a very good sort of graphic that shows how Australia compares against the likes of other international sort of countries and where we sit in terms of the gap of achievement between boys and girls. For the likes of mathematics, the gap is quite large, and it's in terms of in favour of boys. And that is consistent, as I mentioned before, across all the other international countries, but also we're up there in terms of the widening of the gap with France as well. So it is growing in that gap. The gap in reading in international assessments for girls and boys, the gap is widening, but it's not as fast. So that's the international sort of comparison there. What we're also seeing is in the likes of TIMS, which is another international assessment that focuses on the trend in maths and science and looking at years 4 and year 8 students. And again, that trend continues with regards to boys outperforming girls in mathematics, and then also the story around science is still an even pattern there as well between boys and girls. So if you're looking at the international sort of situation, Australia is trending as similar to other international countries in terms of boys and girls. But then if you're looking at historical patterns domestically with regards to the NAPLAN, the trend hasn't shifted much since the opening of NAPLAN back in 2008.
Thank you. Just back to my first question in relation to teachers and gender. I understand you're saying you don't have that data. Is it the view of the department at the moment? Yeah. Is it the view of the education department that having more evenly balanced workforce in terms of males and females is a desirable thing and something to work towards, or do you think it's not really relevant to attainment of boys or girls or anyone?
I think one of the key elements in terms of teaching workforce is really around quality of teaching. It's of course great to have a range of role models for our young people to see in the classroom, but it's the quality of teaching that is particularly critical in ensuring that all students have an opportunity to succeed in their schooling years and in early childhood and in higher education as well. So the government has taken a number of actions with respect to attraction and retention of teachers and quality of teaching. There are a large range of actions under the National Teacher Workforce Action Plan. There's also been the Commonwealth Teaching Scholarships. So the Australian Government is investing $160.1 million from 2023 to 2024 onwards to 2030 to 31 in the Commonwealth Teaching Scholarships. Up to 1,000 scholarships are available in each round, with 5,000 scholarships available over 5 rounds. 3 of the rounds have been delivered with almost 3,000 scholarships received. There are key target cohorts within that Commonwealth Teaching Scholarships program: First Nations people, people with a disability, English as an additional language or dialect, low socioeconomic status, and people from rural, regional and remote backgrounds. So I think that goes to your question in terms of having a broader range of people within the classrooms. I do have data in relation to Commonwealth Teaching Scholarships only in terms of gender of students who are undertaking their initial teacher education. That data has, from the first 3 rounds, around 2,000, so 2,098 who have identified as female, 850 who have identified as male, and 28 who have not disclosed or marked other.
So just those numbers again, sorry.
Sure, absolutely. So we've got
980?
2,098, 2098, identified as female.
800, okay.
850 male and 28 other.
Okay. But just to clarify, and I've got one more question after this, Chair. Just to clarify, there's no real targeting to try and have that as any type of. You did say that you were targeting people on other, in relation to rural, regional, and remote, and Indigenous and that sort of thing. But there's no specific targeting to try and have more males involved in teaching.
To my knowledge, it's not an explicit component of that particular program. I think the evidence, and Aero might talk to this later when they're on, the evidence is a bit mixed in terms of whether or not that is a strong determining factor in terms of attainment.
Okay, and just one more question, and your view on this is the trend of people coming out of not the department employing people and encouraging people into educational careers and higher education from other professions mid-career, instead of maybe mainly focusing on sort of school leavers going into teaching degrees as school leaver, as university courses. It seems to be, anecdotally, I see it as a trend and a positive trend. Is that something that's being encouraged and worked upon?
Yes, I don't have the full information here, I'm afraid. My colleague who's in the teaching branch only started this week, so we thought it probably wasn't a good time for her to turn up. She's still learning her patch as well, so I will have to take some of that on notice. But we do have a high achieving teachers program which goes to that sort of question that you're talking about. So people who have experience outside the teaching sector that may be able to bring that into the teaching workforce and bring some of that additional lenses of life experience and other experience across trades or corporate fields and so forth into the classroom. But happy to provide some further information on that program on notice if that's useful.
That would be useful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
I also have some further information from the higher ed side of things, if that's helpful, Chair, or if you want to move the questioning on, I'm happy to be guided by you.
If it's brief, I think that's okay to update now, and then I'll hand to Mr. Repicoli for some questions.
So just very briefly, the Commonwealth Prac payment that I mentioned before, which started in 2025, one of the disciplines is teaching. And of course, the Commonwealth Prac payment is there to encourage anyone who is thinking about undertaking a study at university to enter the teaching profession to perhaps consider participation if financial placement poverty issues had been a concern for them. So that's certainly a key equity measure for participation that the government has put in place, particularly to that broader shortage around the teaching workforce that states and territories are experiencing and have been experiencing for some time. There is also the outreach funding program that where unis receive $44 million in funding to do more outreach into schools and to communities, accessing people and talking and reaching people who may not necessarily have thought that they would have an aspiration to think about going on to further study and into careers like teaching, for example. So that's just another kind of key targeted program where we're looking to do what we can to increase the attraction of people out there who might want to consider entering teaching as a profession. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Repicoli.
Thank you, Chair. And just to follow on from Mr. Birrell's questions a little bit here, I knew the difference between male and females was great in teaching, but to hear those numbers, like there is a vast difference in males and females there. Just speaking from my daughter's experiences, my daughters love their male teachers. They think they're absolute superstars. They also like their female teachers, don't get me wrong. But so there is nothing out there right now to get more men and more males involved in teaching. So it's not one of the priorities right now.
So we wouldn't say it's not a priority. We would say that the role of recruiting teachers is the role of the schools and the education sectors and systems themselves. They will recruit based on merit. They will also recruit based on what a school needs. And so whilst there isn't any, say, affirmative action measures for male teachers, there is definitely a focus on quality, on merit, and on finding the most appropriate person for the job within that school environment.
Yeah, very good. And do you think there's a lack of knowledge here for men in general that can see this as a profession to get into?
I would say that there are many job roles that have some historical level of gender bias. Teaching and nursing, early childhood education are many of those jobs. I wouldn't say there's a gap in understanding that those jobs are for everyone. It's just that sometimes not everyone is attracted to those jobs. We do have in place things like career advice, and that career advice goes all the way from early learning through to higher education to make sure that we can influence people's decision making. I mean, as you say, and as we have said, having good role models in the classroom is another thing that influences students' decisions, and so being able to see good quality teachers will also encourage people to enter the workforce as well.
Thank you very much. And my next question is around retention. In the information that you provided, year 7 and 8 students to year 12 students, the retention of females is 85.3% versus males 77.6%. What are the factors there as to why we're seeing a much larger number of females be at school and stay at school?
I can talk about the data, but in terms of the reasons behind why more boys are leaving schools before the end of year 12, I think I'll pass to my colleague. But in terms of the data, so yes, I can confirm that the data sort of shows that girls are actually staying in school for longer between when they start high school to when they actually finish high school in year 12. That is a pattern that has occurred over a long period of time. With regards to boys, there is a trend around boys getting to year 10, and then there's a bit of a drop off for the likes of the senior secondary high schools. That's year 11 and 12. Now, there's within the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement, there is an identification here that year 12 or senior secondary certificates are not always the only pathway to success, that there's other alternative pathways with regards to what students may want to pursue, whether that be through a vetting schools, an apprenticeship, a scholarship, etc., an alternative pathway. There is agreement within the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement to look at and develop a new measure around how to actually measure, report on and target those interventions that individual schools may actually look at a student around whether they want to choose an alternative pathway throughout their schooling, whether that be in that apprenticeship or scholarship area. What we do see is also in once teenagers actually go into the apprenticeship and the Cert 2 and 3, there's a larger completion rate, or there's a very similar. Sorry, I'll correct myself. There's a similar completion rate between boys and girls on completions at the Cert 2 and Cert 3 levels. So there's no real difference at this stage in terms of completions of certs in the vet world as well. But in the actual completion and finishing school at the end of year 12, there is a significant drop-off in difference between males and also females during that period of time. In terms of some of the factors that go into that, I'll hand over to my colleague to go through some of those issues there as well.
So those factors are very multi-pronged. I think they go to gender, again, the feeling of safety and well-being in school. But under the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement, all governments have agreed to undertake some collective work to better understand and provide education ministers more information on school attendance, learning and mechanisms to advance evidence-based approach in this area. It is very complex. And we're expecting to be able to undertake that collective work with states to better understand and provide information to education ministers on socioeconomic diversity, the impact in schools, student learning, and approaches to address these impacts. And ministers will receive that by the end of 2027. So it's not something that is easy to answer. I think there are many layers in the response to that. It's quite different between schools, and it's something that we are very focused on trying to understand more about.
Thank you very much. And if you take into account the amount of students that are going through vet courses that do drop out before the end of year 12, it's about 3 to 4% that are going to do that. So still about a 5% gap there of difference between male and female students of actually finishing high school or going on to further education afterwards as well. So it is something that we definitely need to look at. With that other bit of a gap, what you're seeing now, and I know that you're reporting on next year, what do you think are the things that we can do now to make a difference in this space?
Look, I'm not sure I have a very specific answer for you. There are many things that we continue to look at to make sure that students are achieving quality outcomes in school. And they really go to not just looking at the results, but making sure that people have a good experience in schools, school attendance, making sure that we're identifying student needs early, whether that be students with a disability, with a specific focus on what we can do for our First Nations students, and obviously if there are differences in gender, what we can do in that respect as well. The evidence is varied. You might want to, again, specifically refer this one to ERO. They may have a good research base on this and have worked with schools to understand what's working precisely on the ground at the moment.
No worries. Thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Give the call to Ms. Cheney.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in, I guess, what the department understands to work. So you state that ACARA hasn't conducted any specific research on differences in outcome based on gender, cultural and linguistic diversity, socioeconomic status, and hasn't conducted any specific research on solutions. Who do you see as being responsible for that research? Is it ACARA or is it the department?
So we would refer to ERO as the education research organisation who would have responsibility for a lot of that. However, the Department of Education also does look at the data to try and understand what the trends are. Of course, that influences our work with states and territories, and states and territories are also looking at what is working or not working within their schooling environments. Of course, there is a layered diversity on that. No one state is the same, but also within the state, there's a lot of variability between what occurs in a metro setting compared to a regional or a remote setting. And so all of those things are starting to influence our focus on attainment. We also look to what's occurring internationally.
Yeah, so just picking up on that point, just to extend a little bit further. So the likes of the research of what works, that would normally be generated by the individual states and territories, because they would actually see the results of their schools and would have the determining factors around what sits behind some of the reasons behind that as well. Likewise with some of the non-government schools, the Independent Schools Australia, and also the Catholic institutions as well. In terms of how you actually then elevate that up to the national sort of picture, that's where we also have the likes of the ERO, and each education minister will actually determine the research agenda for ERO in the coming year, and generally that is looked at with regards to equity and a range of other sort of areas of focus for which our ERA can actually provide you with more detail around that. And then there's the international component around what do we actually see is happening internationally, both in terms of the OECD, and our higher ed colleagues could actually provide some further details around the Education at a Glance, which is an annual publication which delves into the details around a raft of programs and initiatives and outcomes, both in terms of early childhood, schooling and higher ed, all within one publication. And then there's a range of other international... Sorry.
Who does that publication? Sorry.
The OECD. It's the OECD.
So whose job is it to learn from that and say, how can we take the OECD learnings and apply them to education in Australia?
So that's a collective response.
Yes, Fleur de Crepney, it's the job of my area to produce the statistics, but I would say that it's a whole of department responsibility to look at those findings and you know, draw what lessons they need to learn from that. Yeah.
I would probably say in a schools environment, it's, again, because we work in a federated system, it's the Department of Education, it's also the Departments of Education in each of the states and territories. We also work with the non-government systems as well, so the Independent Schools Australia and the National Catholics. So it's a collective responsibility, and it's collective because we have a joint funding agreement between the Commonwealth and the states, so that's the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement. And as each of the jurisdictions and the Commonwealth sign up to that agreement, it means that we're all focused on improvements in education. And so there's a strong mechanism through the Education Ministers meeting where both the Commonwealth, all of the jurisdictions are able to bring evidence forward and suggest how we focus on our future reforms and what goes into building the next funding agreement. So it is a dispersed model. The same thing would happen for early childhood, where there is a federated system and a funding agreement. In higher education, it's different. In higher education, it sits much more within the department, where we look at exactly what's occurring and work with universities to influence that through the compact arrangement.
Thank you. And I guess probably leading on from that, obviously the committee is really interested in looking at potential evidence-based solutions for addressing some of the gaps. A lot of your submission is focused on describing those gaps rather than explaining what's causing them or evaluating what's worked. Can you point to any program that the department has evaluated that actually contributes towards closing one of those gaps at scale? Now, what has the department found works in addressing these statistical differences that you've identified in your submission?
So we have the large national data sets. What I would probably do is actually point you to the submissions that come from the jurisdictions themselves. So I know you have a submission from South Australia and another one from New South Wales. They have the direct outcomes of the schools in their jurisdictions. There's also a submission from the independent schools and the Catholic schools. They may be able to point to what works. I say what works is because that's not always a national data set. So we can, as you can see in the submission, it works through what's occurring, where the levels of performance are. But what works is often not a data set. It's more qualitative information, and that's the information you should be able to find in those submissions. And as I said before, because we work with the states and territories, that's where we get our qualitative information from as well.
And obviously there are real benefits in being able to do some analysis at an aggregate national level, especially if there are different things being tried in different states, so you can work out what works and what doesn't. As part of the huge amount of funding that the federal government gives the states, what data is expected in return so that you can actually undertake some of that comparative analysis?
So just a couple of things around the data that's expected. So we have a quite a large amount of publicly available data that is reported within ACARA's annual National Report on Schooling, the ANR, and that's has a lot of the information around NAPLAN, all the educational outcomes that are there, and again broken up by a range of priority equity cohort, including disaggregated by gender, and that includes the likes of attendance, retention, attainment, and certification. And then there's also information contained within that report around the various different initiatives and programs that are being implemented in the likes of 2025, because it's reported back then, by the states, the non-government institutions, and also the Australian government around how to meet the Mbappe Declaration, so around equity and excellence, and a range of sort of areas around that. In addition, I would also point to the Minister's progress report on the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement that actually provides a range of case studies by either states or also the independent sector and the Catholic institutions around what they see as highlights for the likes of the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement for 2025. So it may not actually cover the likes of reducing the gender divide between boys and girls, but it does actually provide you with what is the case studies that are of importance to the areas of schooling for states and also the non-government institutions there as well.
But it's largely qualitative. I mean, I suppose as an ex-management consultant, the thought of being able to compare however many schools we have in Australia with the different approaches that are being able to take, that are being taken in different states or different school systems, and actually being able to produce statistically significant data at scale to say Queensland's trying this, South Australia's trying this, and we can see that this works better than that. Is something that only the federal government could do with that national perspective. Is it that that's not seen as a role of the Federal Education Department, or do we just not have access to the degree of information that would be required in order to, I guess, come to some conclusions about causality and what actually works, or is it just that because of our federated model, it's up to the states to just make their own decisions and decide what they think works?
So there's definitely some complexity in a federated model, and so under the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement, there is a lot of flexibility for delivery for each of the school systems to make sure that they can respond to local needs and have a schooling model that works in that jurisdiction. Of course, there are some national consistencies, and those consistencies are things like the data sets that we've talked about. So making sure that there is some consistent information on how we pull those achievement frameworks.
Yes. And also, as you'll have ACARA coming up next. ACARA will also, one of the key components for ACARA is the actual national reporting, and making sure that there's national consistency with regards to reporting, and that includes the likes of how does attendance be reported in a nationally consistent way? How do we actually look at literacy and numeracy in a consistent way using NAPLAN? So that national consistency happens in a small subset of those key indicators, but there's only a few that are there. But then, how do you actually look at causality of initiatives linking to those individual indicators? Is a little bit more sort of challenging and difficult to actually do as well.
But surely the most important part, like to say, what delivers better outcomes than other things? Isn't that, should that not be exactly what ACARA should be focused on? Work out what works and what doesn't?
There's a lot of work that occurs in the system. We also have things called the National Education Initiatives, the NEIs, and that's a lot of joint work between the jurisdictions to make sure that we do have a good understanding of what's working. As you know, we have a lot of things inside the BAFSA, like the anti-bullying rapid review, things like that. That means that the Commonwealth and the states are working together to find solutions to what works on particular factors that might be influencing attendance and education outcomes, to make sure that we can provide a national framework. And then, of course, the implementation of that national framework might be different depending on how a state registers schools, or the specific approach to curriculum in each of the jurisdictions. And so there is always flexibility. It does make it complex, but it is something that we are committed to working together, so that when we have these big challenges, that we can work through those national education initiatives to understand what's happening and come up with a national framework that guides the implementation of each of the jurisdictions.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I appreciate we're going over time, but I just want to give Mr. O'Brien a chance to ask his questions to the Education Department. Are you there, Luke? I think we may have lost him. Okay. Thank you, witnesses from the Department of Education, for your attendance today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. You'll be advised by the Secretariat of the due date for any questions taken on notice. Thank you for your attendance today and your engagement with the committee.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I now welcome the representative from the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority to give evidence. For the benefit of Hansard, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Good morning, everyone. My name's Stephen Ganneal and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority.
Thank you. Well, this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, has the same standing as proceedings of the House. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Do you wish to make an opening statement before we proceed to discussion?
Only to say that I'm here to help. I think it's a really important issue that is being raised through the inquiry, and also obviously point to our submission that we've put before you all. But there's a lot in that and a lot of links to different things as well. So really happy to dig into any of the detail that people might want, and also happy to take anything away and bring back to the committee to help with the important work. Thanks.
Very good, thank you. I might lead off with the questioning before handing to colleagues. Can I start at the highest possible level and ask about some clear definitions and understand how they align, how the way ACARA thinks about this aligns with the Department of Education. How does ACARA define educational attainment at the highest possible level, and what data specifically does ACARA use as a sign that a student might be falling behind? What factors should be considered by this committee as major barriers to educational attainment?
So thank you, and I'll just make sure, and please jump in if I'm heading down the wrong path of what you're asking. The definitional issues are really important, particularly in a federated system that we have for national reporting. So for ACARA, it's one of the most important parts of our work is to make sure that we're trying to report on the same things across the 8 states and territories, but also across sectors and right down to the individual school level, of course. I think in our submission, we talked about really attainment in the way that you're sort of asking that there starts very early on in education, right from early childhood. And we sort of pointed towards the AEDC as the probably the best source of information about how children are tracking in those early years. During the schooling period, which is really where ACARA is most focused, we obviously have the National Assessment Program, and that has a particular focus on literacy and numeracy attainment. That starts from year 3 and then obviously continues in year 5, year 7 and year 9. I think importantly for the committee, one of the key parts about that is that that's a census-based assessment. So we try and get as many students as possible across the country to participate. Now, the participation rates are up around, that sort of over 90%, which is a really good achievement in terms of getting a broad range of information about students across all parts of our country. But it is focused on literacy and numeracy. We also then, and I heard the end of the department's presentation, where we're also responsible for reporting on outcomes and attainment levels across the country. And so those are determined through those negotiations with the states and territories about what those definitions are. And we have a wealth of data on there as well. And I'm happy to talk to any of those individual parts, but Year 12 certification, the attendance of students, those other matters. So there is a lot of data. A lot of it can be broken down into the subgroups, such as male, female, but can also look at socioeconomic demographics, language background, and a number of other remote geolocation, etc. So hopefully that helps, but again, happy to dig in anywhere you like.
Thank you. So a clear message from your submission is that the kind of aggregate male versus female comparisons in educational attainment miss other factors that are going on. Additionally, you talk about specifically the risk of identifying a general boys and girls pattern in behaviours to education while missing, for example, First Nations males in remote or very remote settings. What are the most glaring blind spots in how we track educational attainment? And if the committee wanted to recommend one change that would most improve the system's ability to see these cohorts, what would you point us to?
Look, I'm probably just picking up on that first point. I think what we want to make sure that when we're looking at the data is that we're considering all of the factors that might be contributing, if I put it that way. So I don't want it to appear that we're in any way minimising that we should be looking at the differences between male and female achievement. I think that is incredibly important. I think the other data that's in there is also part of this, and so looking at whether girls in particular from low socioeconomic groups are even more represented in terms of either higher levels of performance or lower levels of performance as well. So I think my advice on that one would be that we do look at the detail that exists within those measures that can give us further information about where we would then put our energy. And I think we've just been briefing people this morning and yesterday on the national results for NAPLAN that are due to come out next week, and that does give us an indication of where those gaps are. I heard one of the members ask before about wanting to know where things are happening that are successful. I think that's a crucial part of this. So I would just really reinforce that the reporting points to areas for further investigation. What we want to see is that we're then picking up things that are actually working. And so a national assessment program and a national data collection are a really important part of that, so that we can do that. Without things like NAPLAN, we would have anecdotal sort of evidence, or we would think that girls are doing better here and boys are doing worse there. We can certainly measure that, and we can be quite precise in terms of not just where they're doing better or worse, but at what levels of achievement. So we know that girls, for instance, are more represented in the higher bands of proficiency for NAPLAN. So they're doing better at the top end as well as sort of at a mean level. So much better than boys. And it's completely the flip side in numeracy. But there's some really important information even in that level of data, that for numeracy, for example, when we were looking at the data from this coming release, it tends to be that boys are overrepresented in numeracy from year 3, and that continues through to year 9, but it stays fairly steady in terms of the percentages in the higher levels of achievement. Whereas for females in the literacy areas, they tend to, that gap tends to widen. So there's more and more girls in the higher ends of achievement than boys over time from years 3 to 9. You can imagine, which is partly why very supportive of that this inquiry is occurring. You can imagine that that's really important to try then and understand why that is, because the implications for that for those individual students, but also for us as a nation, means that we're having boys with early success in mathematics, which then translates into different choices that they can then make as they progress through schooling and then into the university sector or into work. And on the flip side of that, an underrepresentation of boys' achievement in the literacy domains means that their options are reduced where those things across the curriculum are so important. So, and that's why we privilege literacy and numeracy. They are the foundational skills, and they're the foundational skills for further learning in all of the other areas of the curriculum.
Thank you. Your submission outlines current limitations in effective data collection and talks about the unique student identifier as a way to enable measures of retention and progression. Can you walk the committee through the role unique student identifiers play, and then let us measure things that we currently can't, and what the practical or privacy barriers to introducing one have been?
Yeah, I can certainly comment on the first one. I think the practical barriers one, we don't have a role in sort of setting up that legislation, so it's probably a better one to go to the department. But in terms of the universal student identifier, a number of the states and territories already have a student identifier that allows them to really look at what the achievement over time is for individual students, and then look at that at an aggregate level. It gives us further information about how that student achievement is tracking over time with matched data. So as an example, ACARA currently reports on apparent retention, not real retention, right? So, and you will see in some of the data that has perverse outcomes, where some of the retention, apparent retention, can be because of movement between the jurisdictions, for example, or movement between sectors. Those sort of things are not picked up. If we think about the apparent retention just as a net, right, net outcome, so we don't know the ups and downs in terms of the specifics there. What real retention would provide us, which would be provided by a universal student identifier, would be what we would know. So, for example, particularly for our smaller, subgroups of students, those students where some of these attainment issues are most pronounced, they can be crossing the borders of state-based education systems, and they can be lost in some of that data about apparent retention or net retention. Being able to understand where students are across the country would reduce actually improve the quality of the data, and therefore improve where we're able to really prioritise our effort and making sure that funding policy work is going to those students most in need. And that, of course, can be some of the subgroups around indigeneity in terms of language background, geolocation, but also boys and girls as well. So a universal student identifier is sort of as it sounds, it allows us to make sure that we're tracking the individual students, and when we aggregate that, we have real data rather than proxies for really a net outcome. So hopefully that's as clear as I can be, that universal student identifier, in terms from a purely data perspective, and then looking at where we put effort, would be a significant improvement. That's not to diminish the fact that that needs to be carefully considered in terms of ensuring we maintain privacy levels, and that that it's not then used to dictate what students can achieve. I think it's another one that we just got to be really careful with, is that, of course, all of these means and those things can point to areas of concern, but it's a mean, it's not the results for all students. And so we just got to keep an eye on that part of becoming better with the use of our data. It still doesn't at a mean level particularly focus on the individual outcomes for those students. So there's plenty of students that buck those trends of mean, if I put it that way. So we've got plenty of girls that are doing really well at mathematics. It's just that we don't have as many of them, and are disproportionately represented in other ways against boys, and vice versa.
Thank you. So you described the measurement framework for schooling and the National Report on Schooling as the backbone of national reporting. And you note that the availability of your data items presents an opportunity to strengthen analysis beyond single variable reporting. Within your existing mandate, what could ACARA report differently that would give this committee and the public a sharper picture of who is falling behind?
Look, I think my response to the Universal Student Identifier would be a significant strengthening of that. In terms of what we do provide, there's lots of data in there, right? So the issue from my perspective is that it's not that we don't have the data. I think it can be strengthened, and that's the USI that I've spoken about. I think what the measurement framework and the key performance indicators within that provide is an opportunity for where we want to focus. And so I think there's a risk at times of us having more and more data that probably just reinforces what we already know. So, as an example, we know this is the case. I think we can have better data to look at how we respond to that, but I would hate to think that we're just going to try and collect more data. it is one of our favourite sayings around, just keeping on weighing the pig doesn't make it fatter. I think it's the same thing with data. We don't want to just get more and more information if we know what the problem is. In terms of that reporting then, for example, I think trying to be as specific as we can be about where we want our effort to go. There's an opportunity cost with wherever we put that effort. So if we distribute that across too many areas, it means that we're not really having a focus on the one or two or the smaller subset. So the current measurement framework does include some of those areas for focus. You'll be aware that the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement has areas of focus for funding relationship as well. But that would be my thing, is I think, we really need to be as specific as we can be about where we want to put that focus. This is obviously one of them. The challenge is there's a whole heap of others as well in terms of the disadvantage in terms of student socioeconomic and social capital that exists differentially across our country. There's also our very clear challenges around First Nations achievement and performance around literacy and numeracy in particular. So that's where I think it gets more challenging, is how do you make those decisions about where you want to put your effort and the focus without dropping the ball in other areas.
Okay. Thank you. I'll give the call to Mr. Burrell.
Thank you. Thank you for your evidence. I did like your metaphor around not just continuing to weigh the pig, but working out how to make it fatter. But in the previous evidence, you referred to one of my colleagues trying to ask questions about, okay, whose responsibility is it to look across Australia and say that this program might be working here, therefore, or is this program working well here? Is this doing some good things, and should we look at using that information to operate it more nationally? And we struggled to get answers to that, to be honest, as to whose responsibility it was and how that happens. So I might just ask a specific question to say, for example, there is a Women in STEM cadetship program. Whose job is it to assess the outcomes, positive or negative, of that program, and make recommendations on whether that type of thing works, and can that be expanded, or should something different be tried, or something else? That's the first question. I might come back to another question. I'll let you address that.
I probably can't speak to the specifics of it, other than sort of to give a more general response, if that's okay. I think, but I did hear those questions, and I think, that does go to my thing around the data can point us to where the effort should occur and where the learning might be occurring, but the data in itself doesn't answer the problem, right? It tells us more information about where that might be. Well, from a CARA perspective, what we would hope is that those programs that are put in place then have really clear evaluation parts of that program, and that would be where we'd be expecting that the data that we collect is then used in those evaluation programs. So, for any individual program such as the one you mentioned, usually it would be where the funding's coming from is where that evaluation would then be determined, and to see whether it's meeting its objectives, but also doing that effectively in terms of the funding that goes towards it and those things. I do want to just pick up on the broader issue, if that's okay, just to say that I think you've got the Australian Education Research Organisation. I think they're coming on after me. I'd say that's part of why they were set up, is to look at these type of areas of concern and to drill into further what is happening where that can be picked up through the data that it's being done well, or on the other side where there are concerns. So at a macro level, or more of a national level, I think Aero is one of the the parts of the national structure that's set up to do that. And I think it's Jenny Donovan is coming after me, and she'll certainly talk to you about that. They use the data collections from ACARA extensively to look at that as well. So they are doing some of that next level work. The federated system of education also means that the jurisdictions are doing a lot of that work themselves. So looking at, yes, the national data that we collect, but they have more of the data that at the school level that allows them to be more specific about what's going on. So if you think about, as an example, you can have a really great program in a school, but if the kids aren't there, if they're not attending, then the program can be as good as you want it to be. But they've got to be there to actually benefit from it. So
that's part
that
of the
triangulation of data. Sorry?
It's part of the evaluation, surely.
Yeah, correct. And I think, to be frank, that is where at times I think we need to be more sophisticated in this as well, is often we'll look at the research and look at programs that we think have been successful here or overseas, and then implement those. If the evaluation doesn't get to those type of questions about, well, we've seen it work elsewhere, we've seen that there are these successful markers, and it hasn't worked on this occasion. If we don't actually look at why, it may not be because it hasn't. It may not be because that the approach is wrong. It may be because some of the factors underneath that weren't there, right? So that's the stuff we're sort of talking about, right? Is that if you don't have students in front of you, you can't do it. The other one is teacher capability and confidence, and supporting those teachers that are then asked to enact some of those programs or initiatives. We know that having them, they're the ones in front of those students. They're the ones that have got to implement these programs, and so the support we provide for those teachers is crucial. As well as the school leadership around this as well. So again, it goes to some of that prioritisation as well. We've got to be, I think, realistic about what we're asking from our schools. We're asking more and more of our schools than I think we ever have in terms of what we want them to do, which is understandable. They're a pillar of our communities. We just have to be real about what that then means, and how we support them to do that.
Thank you. That's all from me, Chair.
Very good, thank you. Can I give the call to Mr. Soon?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ganil, for both your evidence this morning, but also the submission of ACARA. I guess I had two questions. The first one, I note your previous comment about not just continue the measuring, but I guess my point and my question is just in regards to, look, could we have a better system of measurement to understand student attainment compared to the current model that we have, based on your experience with the current regime? And then the second question I had was just another part of ACARA's remit is curriculum, the link between curriculum and attainment, and how you think the national curriculum has the potential to improve engagement, improve attainment through the curriculum itself. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on both those points.
I might start with the curriculum one, if that's okay. So that's front of mind for me as well. So certainly what happens in the classroom in terms of engagement is obviously crucial. And that goes to, how we do engage students, and, making sure that we're responsive to the differences of students is really important. And again, to go back to that previous example I was saying, we've got to get them in the classroom, right? So there's, real skill in working with communities and working with families, and for sort of all of us, reinforcing the importance of education and schooling in general. In terms of then the curriculum, whenever I am now talking about the Australian curriculum, I talk about that as a promise to our young people. So we put in that document what we want for all of our children. And therefore it's quite big, right? There's a lot in there about what we want for children. But it only sort of goes to what we want. Now we make some, decisions about that, about what we want in there. You'll all be aware that we're looking at that curriculum right now around anti-Semitism, Jewish culture and understanding, as well as Australian values. So, it's important for us to keep the curriculum up to date with what we want for children, and to respond to the changes in our broader environment and in society that we want to respond to. How that's then translated though into classroom activity again comes back to that teacher that's in front of them. And so there are things within the curriculum that we can do, making sure that is broad in terms of students' interests, and the ways in which they engage with schooling. And so, the breadth of the curriculum is important because it's what we want them to learn, but it's also because we all have areas that we find more interesting than others, and connecting into that. I think one of the things we've got to really respond to is obviously something's happening there early on about how we engage our girls with mathematics, and how we talk about mathematics to girls. I don't know if all of you saw, there was a T-shirt being sold recently about, I don't like maths, I'm a girl, or something, as crude but as damaging as that can be. So I think the curriculum certainly has a role to play in this, and that's that breadth, making sure that the content is clear about what we want children to learn. I think the impact and implication on individual students, though, is much more pronounced at the classroom level. You'll hear from Jenny Donovan from Aero around some of the research about how to best to engage children in their learning. That, of course, changes over time for students. It's very different to engage a 5-year-old as it is to a 17-year-old. So in those choices and agency of students as they go through schooling also changes. So it's a long sort of answer around this, except to say that basically I think the curriculum does have a role, but in itself it's not sufficient. We need to look at all the other component parts of that as well. Just on you asked about the strengthening of the data, I think, as well, whether there were things that we could do better. I think I don't want to sort of overstate that everything's perfect. That's not the case. I think we're always looking at ways to improve both the data we collect, how we report it, and also whether there are other areas that we should be collecting data about. I think in terms of attainment, I'd probably go back to that original submission and what I talked about previously, which was that knowing the real data about actual students through a universal student identifier would strengthen what we know, and give us more precision about the quality of the data, and therefore more likelihood that our policies or programs to address those things would be more likely to be successful, because it's frankly more real, right? So it's clearer. You can imagine tracking a particular student over time, where you can then see where have they been, which schools have they attended, what's their attendance looked like, what kind of movements have they had to make between schools for various reasons. We have proxies really for all of that at the moment. We know they move, but we don't know who, and to what degree of those individual students.
Thank you, Mr. Ganil.
Ms. Cheney.
Thanks very much. And I'm really interested in the data, and I guess in how we get the most out of the data. And I suppose one threshold question is whether there is so much noise in the data that it's really hard to draw conclusions about success or failure of particular programs or initiatives. But I'm assuming if you can do that at a national level, you get more statistically significant results than if you're doing it at a state level. So I'm interested in, I guess, whether ACARA has been involved in any randomised control trials or other ways of assessing policy outcomes, and also whether, if ACARA had access to school level data, and I take your point that more data is not always going to be better, but if that data is already being provided at a state level, if the states were able to provide school level data to ACARA, could ACARA conduct more meaningful research on what works and what doesn't using randomised control trials or more sophisticated data analysis mechanisms, knowing what the inputs are?
So I think, we do have school level data because we also run the My School website. So we provide data on every school in the country, and that includes some of that attainment data, if I use that sort of language that you were using before. So it includes the National Assessment Program, the literacy and numeracy, and it also includes more demographic data, breakdown of male, female students, those things. So we do have that data. I think in terms of your question about how that's then used in random control trials and those things, certainly in my previous roles in state-based education systems, that is what's used in terms of the data. So, and the states and territories certainly have more precise data about government schools. They may not have the same level of data about independent schools or Catholic system schools, but the Catholic diocese would have those, and they do their own research in that way as well. So I think the department we're talking when I came on about that there are some things that we should focus on at a national level. So we should pull those up and say, you know, we all see this as being a challenge, and how do we go about addressing that? And I think that is where the funding agreement comes in. You know, that does provide from the Commonwealth some focus areas that they've identified in working with the jurisdictions. So the USI is one of those. Another one in there is actually a review of the measurement framework itself. So what are we measuring? I think that sort of point about, yeah, the noise, I think I agree with that. I think that's what I was sort of trying to point to before as well, is that we should collect a lot of data, and we have an opportunity to do that when we do these assessments. I think being really clear about through that measurement framework, what are the key parts of the data that we want to see, and then you can dig into the rest, right? So I would expect that we will continue to focus on the relative performance of boys and girls, whether that's then lifted, I guess, into, what are those type of measures or targets or those things that signal that that's a really important part of this is probably the area that I don't think we're in that space at the moment. We've got targets and measurements around low socioeconomic factors and students' literacy and numeracy attainment at that level. Within that, though, obviously, if we want to do better, let's say in maths, one of the things we want to focus on is girls, right? Because they're clearly underperforming in terms of when we assess them in mathematics, and it starts, as I said, very early on. So I think hopefully that helps. I think there's sort of almost a funneling of, well, what does that mean that we need to focus on? So if we want better numeracy outcomes for all children, then one of the things to look at is, well, we have a disproportionate number of girls who are not meeting their potential. I think that's really clear. What we do about it, which is I think where you're then going with that, right, is then looking at, well, where is that occurring the most? Where are we seeing that divide occur? But also where are we seeing that's not as pronounced? And that's, I think, when you're then setting up those research programs as you're describing about, well, what then does make a difference? Just as an aside, one of the things that concerns me about some of this is that we can sort of drop something in to fix a particular issue or address a particular issue. I think we have to be really pragmatic about the level of sort of force from other areas that is probably pushing back against that. And so I mentioned the Kmart t-shirts, right? Like the schools might be doing a wonderful job, right? We really want girls to participate and we want them to be involved in mathematics. We'll have a program that's doing that. And yet, on the other side of that, we know that the home is has the most impact on students. We often talk about the in-school factor is the teacher, of course. So the teacher has the most effect on student performance, but actually that's secondary to what happens in the home. So, I think we can do a disservice to our teachers if we oversimplify it and just say, well, it's teachers that just need to fix this. This is actually a societal issue that we need to address too, is that we do have different performance, and part of that is because we talk about it differently to boys and girls. So there's, I guess, just more to it is my...
Yeah, but I suppose we are working on an assumption that changing the approach in the classroom is able to influence outcomes in different ways. And it just seems like there's such opportunity to use data across the country if we can isolate that. But just so I understand how the ecosystem works, is it that ACARA produces the data, but then it's more Aero that then uses that data to say, we've done an analysis and we can see that this program that was rolled out in a South Australian school and a Queensland school that looked the same otherwise succeeded here, failed there, and we think this is the factors. Does Aero draw the conclusions from the ACARA data, or does ACARA have a role in actually using that data and sifting through the richness of the data to come to conclusions about what we should be doing more or less of?
Well, the part that ACARA is limited on is that part that you're describing, which is the what's happening. So I've just briefed the media about the NAPLAN results, for example, and rightly so, that is the question people are asking. Well, why, right? So I can tell you that there is a gap. I can tell you where it is, how pronounced it is, all of those things. But as you described, the richness is then, well, and what's happening in those places, and how can we do that better? So you're right that Aero, that is part of Aero's role at a national level. I'd also sort of to flip it a little bit about, we actually collect a lot of that data on behalf of the jurisdiction. So they sort of sign up to say, we want ACARA to help with this. And so we run the national assessment program really on behalf of all of the education ministers and governments across Australia. And as part of that, they tell us what sort of things they want us to share, what they think that they need to keep, in their own state and territory, and how they're using that data there. One of the things that is a benefit of the national approach, of course, is that there's a relative measure that they're looking against. And so I think that's one of the positives for it. So, yeah, certainly I think Jenny Donovan would be able to sort of answer some of those questions about how they look at that. And so they do that on behalf of ministers, of course, as well. And so, if ministers want to know, what's happening here, like where are some of these challenges occurring? CARA's got this data that clearly demonstrates there's a differential performance. We want to look at further about what that looks like. We would work with Aero in those situations. But yes, Aero is specifically set up as that research organisation.
More on the why, what the cause is.
Yeah.
And so does ACARA do analysis of that or produce data, either the data itself or analysis of it, that it provides to states that is not part of the data that's shared nationally?
They have access to all of that data. We don't, just on your question about do we do further analysis that others don't have access to, the holdings of the data we manage on behalf of all of those jurisdictions, and so they get all of that data. And some of those states and territories, as you know, are really big, and so they have their own analysis areas that are looking at that and drilling into that data as well.
But I guess if you're South Australia and you rolled out a program or WA and you don't have the scale of some of the big states, when you want to know, has this actually had a material impact or not? But you maybe don't want to go public with that because some minister will cop it if they, rolled out a program that didn't work. Can they use ACARA data to do some analysis versus, equivalent SES schools to determine whether there's been a material impact or not?
Yes. They can. And look, as an example, I know, Tasmania are really trying to lift their literacy and numeracy rates at the moment. I go around the country and talk to all of those ministers and all the secretaries and offer that as well, right? If there's things that we have, because our, like you, what we really care about is that, children's outcomes are improving and we're reducing those gaps. And so, wherever possible, we'll make that happen. Sometimes that means we've got to work through privacy issues or agreements about data usage. But I don't think there hasn't been significant barriers around that, I would say. I think the jurisdictions value being able to learn from each other and to benchmark some of that. And you'll see that with the NAPLAN results, right? They all come out and say how they're going relative to others. And for some of them, that's more challenging because of the demographics of their jurisdiction, as you'd know. But it does mean that they, and all of us have a relative measure. And that goes right down to the student level. So when parents get the NAPLAN report at home, it has where the student sits, but it also says, and this is where how it looks against the country, like against all other students. And there's great value in us being able to have that relative measure. Otherwise, we kind of are just in our little microcosm, and that can happen at a state level as well, as you know.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Mr. Neal.
Thank you. Can I just pick up on where I was earlier and ask, so your submission finishes on this point, and I'll just read a quote to you that we can just explore a bit further. It says, quote, aggregate data may show a general pattern of female advantage in retention and attainment. But this should not be read as evidence that all female students are advantaged or that all male students experience the same level of risk. The inquiry would benefit from particular attention to cohorts where gender intersects with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander status, remoteness, socioeconomic disadvantage, and disability, as these intersections may identify students most likely to experience cumulative barriers to educational attainment. We were discussing some of this in the questions earlier. Can you please highlight the value of intersectional reporting and examines how gender intersects with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander status location and remoteness, socio-educational advantage, language background, and disability. And in that context, I want to ask how we can make targeted policy recommendations for students when their barriers to educational attainment are a cumulative mix of these multiple factors.
Yeah, I'm glad you reread that to me. I've pulled it up here as well. It's a while since we made the submission. Just to probably point out, I think there's two things in that. One was what I said before about it's almost being careful not to typecast all students with what the aggregate is or the mean I was talking about before. Again, I'll use the common one, right, is that we have some brilliant mathematicians that are female and some outstanding boys in terms of their literacy and numeracy skills. So I think that's the first part, is we at an aggregate level, we obviously have an issue and we have something that we have to address. We want to make sure that we reinforce for those students where they're doing really well, whether they're boys or girls, that it's not a predetermined path. And we have this in other areas too about, we can talk about postcode being destination as an example, where there's plenty of very successful people that have not followed that sort of line of expectation or what the mean occurs. So that's just the first thing, which I think is just a really important one, particularly in this male-female differential achievement, is to remember that it's not all students that experience that. The second one is around that cumulative impact that you were talking about there as well. I think we have a First Nations Australian advisory group, and we ran this sort of submission past them, and they will often remind me that it's not the same for all students is the kind of baseline here, right? So the fact that someone has a First Nations background may not be the factor that is most impacting on whether they're doing well or not, right? It actually can be that they're from a very low socioeconomic background. They could also have special needs. And so I think that's the warning part of this, is that as well as looking at the gender part of it, is also to look at what other underlying factors are there that we would need to pay attention to with any kind of policy response. So I think, and that is, I was just thinking about our data. So when we publish that data and we have that available through the national, either the National Report on Schooling or also the National Report on NAPLAN, Literacy and Numeracy, we do make sure you can drill down into the data, but we also have it so that you can look at a collection of those, both subgroups and also demographic details that it can impact. So I think it's really, it's just, I guess, another sort of one about not oversimplification of what is inherently complex, right? Is that, is making sure that when we put money towards this, or that we put a priority on this, that we put it towards things that we have the data on, and we know where that needs to be adjusted for those those subgroups that we're talking about. So, and if I can say that I think we've got to be careful about sort of universal approaches to all that could potentially mean that the opportunity cost of that is that we're not investing where we really, really need to invest. So it's not all girls and it's not all boys. What I think the data would say is that it's disproportionately those lower socioeconomic backgrounds. We know, as well as the geolocation, our remote and regional schools, and so we've got to be careful that with programs that we do differentiate for need. So this equality approach rather than, equitable approach rather than just equal, that everyone gets the same. There are kids that need more, they need more help.
So on that ecological fallacy question, essentially is what we're talking about here. I understand that similarly there's high variance in that non-English speaking language background group as well. Is that right? That when you look into that data and granularity, that effect can move in both directions actually on attainment outcomes.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one too, and it's probably an area where we talk about too of keeping on strengthening some of this information. Is that often through that demographic in the way that we describe it and also define it too means that has different outcomes. And so actually we see that through using that measure, students from language backgrounds other than English will actually do better in a number of areas. It's, that one in particular and other ones are important to look at the definitional component of this. I mean, the gender one is somewhat, not easy is not the right word. I think it's because it has its own areas that are, further developing, but males, females, in terms of that definition, as opposed to what we consider being language background other than English and how that's reported, that is a challenging area just in the terms of the definitional aspect of it, and also the change over time in terms of migration can really impact on that as well, about who's coming to the country in terms of parental occupation, background, education, those things as well. So yeah, that does show some differential performance as well, but the definitional part of that area in particular is important to consider.
Thank you. Ms. Chaney just has one more question before we'll break for lunch.
Thank you very much. And just interested with understanding that it's harder to define some than others, but if you do a regression analysis, which are the most determinant factors in terms of attainment? Can you compare SES or language background or, geography or gender? How do they compare? Which are the factors that it makes the most sense to focus on?
So it's a good question for Jenny Donovan, I reckon, that one, Dr. Jenny Donovan. So she'll be able to talk more about the regression analysis part of it. But I think certainly when they were looking at the way in which the funding occurred for needs-based funding as well, they were looking at those type of things. And in fact, the cumulative disadvantage is recognised in that, so it's not just you get an additional money because you're one of these things. If they all can all impact on educational attainment. So I don't have probably the answer about which one is the strongest predictor. And Jenny may have done some more work in that through Aero. But certainly the recognition of the cumulative impact is there. Mm-hmm. It's also, I think, particularly probably with students with additional needs, is the other factor in this as well, which we don't have the data on. So when you were talking about before areas that we don't have data on students with additional needs in terms of subcategories for the National Assessment Program. We do have it in terms of some of the reporting on schooling, but that's another area that obviously impacts on attainment.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your evidence today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors, and you'll be advised by the Secretariat of the due date for any questions taken on notice. Thank you for your appearance today. This committee will now suspend for a 30-minute break, and we'll resume at 1:30 p.m.
Thank you all.
Thank you. this afternoon's hearing. And I welcome the representative from the Australian Education Research Organisation to give evidence. For the benefit of Hansard, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
My name's Dr. Jenny Donovan. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Education Research Organisation.
Thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and it has the same standing as proceedings of the House. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Do you wish to make an opening statement before we proceed to discussion?
I'm sorry, I'm getting a delay.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
We can ask the questions in a slow way if you would like.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. There's a huge lag where everything that's just been said gets repeated in my audio loop. Sorry.
I will talk to the Secretariat about that now. If you have an opening statement, it might be worthwhile delivering that while we work on the logistics in the background, given there won't be questions coming through then. All right, I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause the submission.
Can I maybe drop out and join again? Would that be the thing to try?
Yes, I'm suspending the hearing. Thank you. Hearing. Would you like to make an opening statement?
Look, I will briefly. Thank you. And I apologise if that technical fault was at my end. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the inquiry into the factors driving educational attainment. It is a core interest for those of us working at the Australian Education Research Organisation. We are the national evidence body, so it's happening again. I'll try to ignore it. We take very seriously what the evidence tells us is most effective to support all children and students to succeed in education. We know that educational attainment is affected by many factors, including most significantly the socioeconomic status of the student. Schools can't change a student's background, so our research has focused on the in-school factors that affect learning success. In schools, the most effective and efficient way to strengthen educational attainment for all students at all stages is to improve the quality of the teaching they get. Teaching quality is the greatest in-school influence on student progress and achievement. Improving teaching quality means implementing evidence-based practices that the research shows are effective to support all learners, irrespective of their gender or background, to experience learning success. Explicit teaching and all that entails, paired with systematic provision of additional support for students at risk of falling behind in their learning, is the recipe to ensure that all students can engage with the curriculum and thrive in their learning. In early childhood education and care settings, all children, including those from diverse groups, benefit from intentional teaching practices, which involve educators making deliberate, thoughtful decisions to achieve quality learning outcomes for children. Ero's submission, which you've read and will have questions for me about, was intended to outline the evidence about the key actions to support sustainable long-term improvement in educational attainment for all children and young people. And I will just note that for some reason, I am hearing everything at a 30-second delay. At the moment, I've got my own voice playing through to me again, so we can give it a crack. I'm doing my best to ignore it, but it may be quite distracting for me to try and engage with your questions and make sensible responses, which is not ideal.
Okay, I think we might suspend the hearing again. The hearing again. I'm not sure whether you were able to conclude your opening statement earlier. Apologies. If you like to add anything to that, or we can proceed to discussion.
Look, let me just say it feels like your attention to this question is a gift, and I'm sorry that I've already squandered several minutes of your time. So happy to proceed.
Very good. All right. That was my delay. I was just waiting there. Can I begin by acknowledging, so obviously the central thread of your submission is that the most effective and efficient way to lift outcomes is to improve teaching quality, and that evidence-based practices like explicit instruction benefit students regardless of year level, subject or background. Would you be able to walk the committee through what evidence-based practice looks like in a classroom and how this looks differently in a ECEC setting, a primary setting, a secondary school setting?
Sure. The evidence-based practice that we describe in detail in our learning and teaching model and advocate through our practitioner guides for teachers and our advice for policymakers is derived from the most robust evidence base there is around what constitutes effective practice. We describe it as explicit teaching. It's variously known as explicit instruction. There are some other names used for it as well. But essentially what it's describing is strongly teacher-led practice where the teacher will introduce a new concept, the part of the curriculum that's going to be taught and learned in the course of a lesson. There may be a little bit of checking to see what the student's understanding already is or reconnection to some previous learning that's relevant to that. The teacher will then make sure that the new concept and content is broken down into quite small chunks of information. They will explain what this is about. They will model what it looks like over time with guided practice from the teacher. There'll be an opportunity for the children to apply the new information for themselves, to practice the new skill independently, etc. But throughout the lesson, there is strong and consistent engagement from the students, continual checking from the teacher about whether the students are understanding and remembering what they're being told and interpreting it correctly. So there'll be questioning, quizzing, different sorts of techniques to just check on what it is that they're hearing when the teacher is describing something to them. In their efforts to practice together, it'll be scaffolded in the first instance, and the teacher will check to see whether they're getting it right or whether something needs to be re-explained, etc. The purpose of this is to achieve mastery. The students will learn something, they will learn it, and they'll be able to retain it in their long-term memories, because then they'll be able to use that new information to build more new information onto, to make connections and ultimately be the creative and critical thinkers and problem solvers that we want all people to be able to be in their lives. The evidence that this approach works is very robust and strong and based on empirical data collected over decades. The reason it works is newer information for us. That comes from cognitive science and developments that have happened in our understanding about the way brains, human brains, learn new information. It turns out they can't learn a whole lot of new stuff all at once because most of the new information gets processed through what we describe as our working memory before it can be lodged in our long-term memory. So the aim of teaching is to make sure new information is lodged in the long-term memory. The way to do that well is not to download a huge amount of information all at once and hope that it sticks. It is to manage the way that is fed through working memory very carefully. So skilled teachers who are good explicit practitioners know how to do that chunking, making sure that working memory doesn't get overwhelmed. If that happens, children become disengaged, they get frustrated, they get distracted, they experience a learning failure, and it demotivates them to continue to try. If we're careful about how we introduce new information and engage them in the learning and support them to succeed, then they're going to stay wanting to be part of this learning journey because it works for them. They experience success, and of course we get the great outcome of them having the new knowledge that we want them to have embedded in their long-term memories. that felt like a long explanation. I'm happy to revisit. I just maybe add that there are some misconceptions around the notion of explicit teaching, because it is a different style of teaching to what most teachers were taught to deliver when they did their own initial teacher education. So there are some people who don't understand the approach perhaps, or don't agree with the approach, don't like what the evidence says, who are inclined to say teacher-led means it's not sufficiently oriented around the student and it is too authoritarian, it is only encouraging rote learning. You know, you get slogans like drill and kill. This could not be further from the truth. Explicit instruction is absolutely about meeting the students where they are at and working very actively to keep their interest engaged, their motivation high, their success inevitable. And it is therefore what we know works to get great learning outcomes.
Okay, thank you. So I was interested, your submission suggests that it takes around 17 years for what we know to become what we do. Can I ask if the practices that we're talking about here are as well evidenced as the research suggests, what explains why there aren't why they aren't standard practices across Australian classrooms? Where's the breakdown happening, and is there anywhere we can look to internationally that's been successful in implementing these education changes that we could look to?
Yes, thank you. Great question. That figure of 17 years is derived from the experience in the health sector, where introducing evidence-based practice was done quite a long time ago compared to Australia, where the notion of evidence-based practice is much more recent phenomenon. In the medical area, the clinical trials delivering an outcome where all GPs are automatically diagnosing, prescribing what the clinical trials have suggested is the better practice. That's where the 17-year gap comes from. Hopefully that's closing. We don't need to have 17 years as the experience in education if we can avoid it, because most of our students leave us by the time they turn 17. So you don't want to be waiting generations for things to shift when you know what could be done differently. The reason the kind of practice that I'm describing is not universal or systematically applied across the country at the moment is, as I mentioned in the first answer, it hasn't been the practice that has been described to teachers in their initial teacher education. For decades, teachers have been told to do something quite different. And it comes from a different kind of tradition, and it doesn't come from an evidence-based place. AERO was created by ministers just 5 years ago to identify what does the evidence tell us about what is best practice. The reason the ministers set a research organisation up was because we had persistent challenges. We have the challenge of student attainment. Depending on the measure you're looking at, it's either plateaued or in decline in some places. We haven't shifted the dial on things like the equity gap in education. So ministers thought if we look to the research, maybe we will find the ways to do things differently that will lead to the better outcomes that we want to see. One of the things that we need to be doing differently, in fact, the most important thing we need to be doing differently is what teachers are doing in their classrooms. Now that AERO's here, we've got the chance to say, this is it, this is what the evidence points to, and do all of the other work that we've been doing for the last 5 years of describing that for teachers, breaking down the research, turning it into practice guides, videos of practice, making sure that our work isn't just targeting primary teachers, that we're also describing this process for secondary teachers, for early childhood, implications for early childhood settings, etc. 5 years is a pretty short period of time, but we've had a huge amount of shift that I'm I'm so pleased to be able to say has happened in that space of time, where we do have ministers responsible for entire systems saying that's what we expect, that's what we want to see in our classrooms, and they are putting the time, resourcing and support into making sure that that shift is rolled out across their systems.
Thank you. Mr. Su is under time constraints, so I'll just pass the call to him.
Thank you, Chair. And look, thank you so much for your submission, Dr. Donovan, and also for sharing so much of your expertise. My question is just in relation to what you said at the outset, which teaching is the most impactful in-school influence on educational outcomes, but obviously individual students' home, family, and outside of school context plays a very significant role as well. I was hoping whether you could just talk us through a little bit about the interactions between those factors and the factors that we do have control of within the schooling environment. So help us really start to understand, well, of the things we can control, how can that shift some of the things we don't necessarily have direct control of in the education system?
Yes. Look, I think there's received wisdom that education can be the great leveller, that no matter what the background, if you give someone a good education, you give them the options and the opportunities. You create the level playing ground. And the sad truth is that that is not what's happening in our education system at the moment, nor has it been like that for a very long time. So we're interested in looking at, in that case, what can we be changing around the way the system is working to ensure that we can level that playing field again, that we can compensate for the different background experiences that children bring when they arrive at school or through early childhood as well. And a good early childhood experience, early childhood education and care experience, quality experience there absolutely will help. The reality is that children come with all sorts of different attributes. The one that has the most impact on their learning success is their socioeconomic background. And by that we mean a bunch of different factors relating to, for example, parents' own education achievement. That's one of the biggest factors feeding into the notion of socioeconomic and socioeducational advantage. What we want is for the child's characteristics as they land at school not to be determining what their outcome is going to be at the end of school. We want that schooling to make the difference, and it can. We know that postcode doesn't have to be destiny, because in all of the work that we've done, and we've been looking into these factors, with such energy for these years, SES is so strongly associated, but not always. Steve Ganil earlier talked to you about, look, we're talking about means and averages, but it doesn't mean that that's the story for every child. Around every mean sits a whole lot of other people, including outliers. And the good news in Australia is that we do have examples of schools where the students come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and that disadvantage will largely be socioeconomic, but it may be compounded by other things like geolocation, First Nation status, English as an additional language dialect, etc. But they managed to get really outstanding results for those students. They managed to get them up above averages, and they managed to sustain those really excellent outcomes over years and years and years. So just for your interest, one of the things that we're doing this year, we have a focus on equity and how to achieve greater equity across the Australian system. We're looking to those schools. What is it that's happening in those schools that, by all accounts, you might expect statistically the children are disadvantaged, they're not going to get great learning outcomes, but they do. There's something going on in those environments which is leading to the good learning outcomes. It won't surprise you to know that the first ingredient is the quality of the teaching that they're receiving.
Thank you, Dr. Donovan, and thank you for the work that Aero has and continues to do. And I apologise, I actually have I have to go to see some explicit instruction in person shortly. So thank
Lucky
you so much.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Soon. I'll just continue with a few others before I'll give the call to my Deputy Chair, Mr. Burrell. Firstly, can I ask, your submission acknowledges that there are some gender differences for educational attainment, but you argue that the magnitude of the gender association is small, quote, especially when compared to the association between socioeconomic status and student outcomes. The Department of Education, their submission echoes that sentiment by framing gender as one of many intersecting factors, and that attainment is cumulative and that differences emerge early, with boys less likely to be developmentally ready for school, and that then those differences persist. Can you discuss with the committee how you consider gender against these other factors, and is there and the risks that a boys and girls framing that could potentially pull policy attention away from more impactful variables?
Yes, it's good to know that what we provided in our submission was consistent with the Australian government. I wasn't able to listen to them earlier today. It is confounding that Mr. Ganil described it as well, that boys' performance on literacy in NAPLAN is on average poorer than girls, but we get the opposite relationship between girls and numeracy. It has been so for a very long time, and you could speculate as to why. And there is a bit to do with girls not maybe being as encouraged to think that they can access numeracy and maths and be successful at it, and similarly for boys. The size of the impact we describe as in just about every instance as statistically insignificant. That is, error in the measurement could account for some of the differences that we're seeing by and large in gender. It is overwhelmed by the significance of the socioeconomic backgrounds of the students. The risk of going down the path of saying there's a gender crisis and there's something that we need to do is people tend to go to very reactive solutions. Well, if boys aren't doing as well at literacy, then maybe we shouldn't be expecting them to read and write as much. If we're not seeing boys succeed in different areas for different reasons, maybe we need to alter the way we manage schooling. The risk is that we leap to solutions that are not evidence-based, and we forget that we really ought to be attending to the evidence-based solutions and giving them a right and proper opportunity to be done well and effect the learning success that we want to see.
Thank you. I'll hand the call to Mr. Burrell now, and I know that Ms. Cheney has questions as well.
Thank you very much. First question is that there was a discussion earlier during the Department of Education evidence about anecdotal attitudes to the prevalence of male teachers in the system, and the anecdotal evidence of it being a positive thing for male role models in schools and as teachers. And I think their view was that there was mixed results in terms of or opinions as to whether that's a determinant or not. And they told us that there are really no programs to encourage males specifically into the teaching profession. Have you got a view on that, or whether there's any evidence, or whether there's anyone seeking any evidence on that, not only in terms of, I suppose, academic attainment, but just social development for particularly young males?
No, I'm sorry. It's not research that we've done or been asked to do, and I'm not aware of any recent research that would offer any insights for you.
Thank you. In your evidence, you did talk about the multi-tiered training
Yes.
of teachers. Can you talk a little bit about that, how that would look and what it would take to roll that out in the Australian system or state systems?
The multi-tiered systems of support is an approach in education acknowledging that students start at different points and for different reasons they will be at different levels of attainment throughout their schooling. So in a typical classroom, a teacher has between 20 and 30 students, and there might be quite a significant variability in terms of the students' level of achievement. Teachers are by and large asked to differentiate their teaching, which is a very opaque notion and pretty difficult to implement if you think about 30 children and the teacher needing to do 30 different things for them simultaneously, consistently, every lesson, every day. Multi-tiered systems of support says that's not a sensible way to try and tackle the issue that we have where children are at different levels. What we need to do in the first instance is describe Tier 1 as being your mainstream classroom, your classroom teacher with the 30 students, and make sure the teaching that happens there is really effective. Do a great job for the majority of students in those mainstream settings, and you'll have fewer students that need more attention, more support. Second tier would be students who need a little bit more. Maybe they've started further behind, maybe they've missed some school, maybe there was some reason why they just did not grasp a really fundamental concept and they need a little bit of targeted attention. Maybe that can be achieved through small group tutoring, maybe that can be a little bit of additional practice, etc. There are ways that teachers can offer additional support for students who need it, with the expectation that they'll be able to continue to be part of the mainstream setting. They're not missing anything at the same time, but they're getting a bit of extra help to make sure that they're brought back up to where the Tier 1 mainstream class is. And Tier 3 would be that small proportion of students that need really significant help. You often for short periods of time, occasionally for longer. So there's something that's really gone missing. There's an additional learning need that they have. There's a reason why they might need one-on-one or withdrawal support for a certain period of time. So the MTSS is a way of helping teachers identify that the first job they have is for the mainstream classroom and they're doing the best teaching they possibly can for all of the students, but B, there are opportunities to give additional assistance to identified students using evidence-based practices and approaches that will support them to get back up to speed and be able to rejoin and participate fully in the work of the mainstream classroom going forward. It's strongly evidence-based and it is being built into the funding agreements with all of the states and territories. So there is an expectation that all of them will be looking at ways of delivering multi-tiered systems of support in their settings.
Can you point to any example of this anywhere succeeding, a pilot or another jurisdiction around the world where this is being used and evaluated?
Yeah, there's a really robust evidence base behind this approach coming from many places, the US, the UK. I'm happy to, if it helps, happy to provide the resources, the references that we draw on. But this one has got a very robust evidence base over a long period of time.
If you could provide that something we could look at in terms of where this is working and how it's rolled out, because I hear what you say and it makes perfect sense. It requires resourcing and perhaps an approach to education that doesn't. I mean, the traditional education's been focused on people's ages. So you're in year 9 if you're 14 or whatever it is, or grade 6 if you're whatever. But this is very much around a developmental, a linear or non-linear developmental pattern, and trying to meet students where they are to try and get them to where they need to be, which involves a rethink and also different resourcing in classrooms, I guess.
Yes, and most of the systems are on their way to doing something along these lines. Most systems have additional support teachers available to support in classrooms. Really what the systems are all trying to do at the moment is identify the good evidence-based approaches to delivering the Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports, because the evidence around what Tier 1 support for the vast majority of students is our learning and teaching model.
And just one more question on quality. You use the term quality teaching, quality of teaching, and it'd be good to flesh that out a little bit more. But we probably don't have time to do that now. But specifically, I'm interested in whether you have done any research, or anyone's done any research into the teaching. When we get teachers who aren't necessarily, the majority of teachers will be school leavers who go to do a university degree in education and go and to be a classroom teacher, and that's their profession, which is absolutely necessary and good. But then increasingly we're getting programs encouraging people to come out of other industries, do mid-career, do teaching degrees, sometimes whilst going straight into the classroom. I'm seeing that anecdotally have a lot of success in terms of bringing some real-world solutions and applications for the curriculum. Is there any research being done on the effect that that's having?
Not by us specifically on that. What matters is the program that teachers in training are exposed to in university, and there has been a recent national shift in relation to what it is teachers are being trained to do. I mentioned that earlier, that for many decades they were trained to teach in a particular way which is not consistent with the evidence base, and has meant that we've got some of the problems that we have. But as of this year, every university has been required to amend its courses to ensure that all training teachers are exposed to the content around effective evidence-based practices. That includes understanding the cognitive science around how brains learn in the first instance, so that it makes sense to them why they would therefore be asked to teach in a particular way and not overwhelm students or do other things that are not going to lead to effective learning outcomes. For the first time, all universities are required to give instruction to training teachers about how to manage their classrooms effectively. Once upon a time, they just didn't do that. They said, you will succeed if you are sufficiently engaging. And they made the trainee teachers take responsibility for what is quite a challenging aspect of teaching. That is, how to manage the behaviour of the students so that they can learn and not be distracted or disrupted, etc. Requiring them to look at the ways that they need to be responsive to the children they have, the families that they're coming from, the backgrounds that they're bringing. All of these things were not required to be part of teacher training in the past, and as of this year, they have become part of the core content for all training teachers. So we can hope that in the future, our new teachers, wherever they've come from and for whatever reason, are going to be much better equipped to step into a classroom and ensure that really successful learning can happen.
Thank you, Chair. That's all. And I'll have to step out shortly, but thank you. Thank you, Ms. Donovan.
Thank you. Ms. Chaney.
Thank you very much. Many of my questions have been answered. I'm really interested in what you said then about, as of this year, every uni's been required to do this. Through what mechanism has that happened?
In about 2021, I think it was, there was a review, the Quality Initial Teacher Education Review. The QITE report was delivered to ministers, and they decided that they didn't want this just to be another report. There'd been many, many reports into initial teacher education. They didn't want this to be another one sitting on the shelf, so they set up a panel which was chaired by Mark Scott. I was part of it. It was called the Teacher Expert Education Panel. No, I've got that wrong. TEEP.
Yeah.
We were asked to look at ways that we could respond to the Quiet report, which had identified a lot of shortcomings in the way that teachers were being prepared in their initial teaching education. The first of our recommendations was create core content, expectations of content that all universities will need to include, and make sure that it addresses the 4 areas that I outlined earlier. They
so
also,
is that done through federal funding agreements, or what's the mechanism that those expectations are set through?
So there is an accreditation process that universities have to put their courses through, in order to meet their agreements for funding. So as part of that accreditation, they needed to be able to demonstrate that their courses have now been adapted to include this core content, and they're also going to be prepared to be part of a quality assurance process that will be conducted independently and over the course of the next few years to ensure that what's been approved through the accreditation process is playing out in practice.
And how long will it take to see whether that has an impact on outcomes? Obviously, it takes a while for a teacher to get trained, start working. There's still only one teacher in the school. What's the sort of time frame? Is that where the 17 years comes from?
Look, it's true that the proportion of teachers arriving in the systems who are brand new graduates every year is very small compared to the current teaching workforce. So it isn't enough to say, well, we'll start at the beginning and we'll train them better, because it will take a long time before we can see their better training delivering us better outcomes. Fortunately, at the same time, in many of the jurisdictions, not all, but in many, they are acknowledging that the evidence-based practice has not been what's been common in classrooms in their state or territory. It is their expectation going forward. Therefore, they are doing things like ensuring professional development is available for teachers, pointing their workforce to the ERA website and suggesting that they will find the kind of guidance that they need there, developing resources for themselves or versions of learning and teaching models, which they collaborate with ERO to ensure is meeting the evidence-based standards that we've described.
Okay,
so
thank you.
It's happening at all of the levels of teaching engagement.
Fantastic, thank you. The terms of reference of this inquiry include looking at the drivers of any differences in outcomes based on gender, cultural, linguistic diversity and socioeconomic status. You've given us a pretty clear message that socioeconomic status is a much bigger driver of differences than the other two. I'm interested in the MTSS model, I also hear your message that evidence-based teaching has got to be the number one priority. With that MTSS model, is the idea that you do that evidence-based teaching for Tier 1, then if you pull some students out who need a bit more support, then you might look at them according to some other factor, such as gender or linguistic background or socioeconomic, in terms of designing effective interventions, or for Tier 3. Like, I'm trying to understand how it works, balancing the kind of one-size-fits-all approach of evidence-based explicit instruction with recognising that some factors, affect outcomes for children differently, and how you can both customise that but also, do the across-the-board stuff. I don't know, that's a very vague question. Sorry.
I think I know what you're trying to get at with that. The factors that appear to be influencing the outcomes, we can't necessarily change. We can't change who the child's parents are and what education they have. So our focus needs to be on the factors we can change, and we can change the way we do our teaching to ensure that we get successful learning outcomes. Now, for some of those children because they've come from backgrounds where there aren't a lot of books, they haven't been read to, they may not have as big a vocabulary. The expectation is that they may be going to need some more support. That'll be identified through diagnostic assessment, etc. And at the moment in Australia, our funding model is designed to enable where we have the need for that need to be met in education. We have the model that was designed by David Gonski all those years ago was about a needs-based funding formula, identifying where we have disadvantage. The disadvantage is associated with outcome. Therefore, that's where we need to be targeting our money. We did that, made that formula and sent out the money, but we didn't see any change in the outcomes, which is when the ministers paused and thought maybe we need to be looking to the research. Maybe there's something we're missing here. It isn't just dollars in, it's something that you do with the dollars that gets you the better outcome.
Mm.
So the expectation is the dollars get used to support things like multi-tiered systems of support, the additional programs, interventions, staffing resources that might be required to deliver those, so that the children who have come from furthest behind or fall behind at any point can be brought back up to speed.
And is there evidence that would back up under that MTSS approach, fixing the mainstream thing so it's evidence-based, but then having, say, a girls' maths group that meets after school where you use a different style of teaching or something that targets girls and boys differently? Or is there any evidence that would actually support different approaches for girls and boys on numeracy and literacy at a level of intervention that's worth doing, given the size of those factors?
There is evidence for absolutely everything, but it depends on your appetite for the quality of the evidence or the standard of the evidence and how confident you would like to be in it. So the evidence I've been talking about is very robust. It's derived from, I think you were talking about randomised controlled trials earlier. It's derived from that level of experimental design. We can have pretty high level of confidence. The kind of thing you're describing, the girls' maths group after school, because there isn't the same kind of robust methodology brought to that, and it's not done on a very large scale, the evidence tends to be anecdotal. And there are a lot of anecdotes in education. You'd want to be careful about making recommendations for a system level or a national level on the back of, well, we've visited 2 schools and they really like it and the girls seem really happy. If you want really good evidence, you've got to go about doing it in a more systematic way. And the sad truth in Australia is we're not good at doing RCTs. There's a bit of suspicion about the way the data will be used, what the findings will say. There's resistance to something that feels like it's an invasion of science into the education domain. I'm speculating a bit, but we have come up against a lot of resistance to conducting RCTs. So it's the short answer to the question is we don't have good evidence because we're not able to run good research into all of those things that are out there. But I'm absolutely confident across the submissions that you saw, you will have heard all sorts of wonderful stories about great things that have been tried and terrific results gleaned. If they're available to be subject to more robust scrutiny, then maybe the ministers could be encouraged to ask us to do that. That's part of what we're here for.
And Jenny, what would you think about, say we said, okay, there's anecdotally, we've got a hypothesis about how girls might better learn maths and boys literacy and, dealing with different people from cold backgrounds. And we actually, at a federal level, said for the next 5 years, let's do an RCT, randomised control trial on these and compare the data against schools of similar demographic levels, which we could do at a national level, in order to learn from that. Would that be useful, or is there so much noise in the data that you wouldn't actually end up with any robust findings?
No, that's the point of going about it the right way, is that you can eliminate the noise and you can be really confident about the findings. If you can set up the research design in such a way that you can control who gets access to the intervention and who doesn't, and you can be confident that there aren't going to be confounding factors there, then you can come away with really clear findings and insights. And if all of the ministers were to agree, this is what we want to know whether this thing that we've attempted or that we're thinking of putting money into or whatever, that's absolutely what we're here to do. Unfortunately, at the moment in education, typically what happens is there'll be a rush into something that looks like a great solution. Think of COVID, and a couple of the systems came up with tutoring initiatives. Let's throw money at making sure the kids don't fall behind. We'll give them access to online tutoring and all the rest. A lot of money got spent. Some evaluations were attempted, but they weren't very robust. We ended up with not a whole lot of information about whether or not that big spend achieved any positive outcomes for anybody. It points to, wouldn't it be great if we could be a little bit more systematic in our thinking and our expectation of, if we're going to spend money, we're going to evaluate carefully so that we know that we're getting what we thought we wanted.
And who, at what level would those decisions need to be made, and that assessment need to be made? The evaluation need to be undertaken. I guess you'd need to get all state ministers on board saying, here are 5 interventions that we would like to know if they work or not, and then ACARA to gather the data and Aero to do the assessment. Is that what that would look like?
Yeah, pretty much. The work that we do is based on what the ministers agree are their priorities at a national level. So the ministers have to agree, which takes time every year. But we do come up every year with a research agenda that reflects their agreed common priorities. They tend to be quite big headline items. Like this year, for example, our priorities are equity, disability, First Nations, and AI. Underneath those headings, there's some opportunities for us to propose projects. And again, it'll be the ministers and their departments who will indicate their enthusiasm for one or other. Some of our work in the past, it must be said, has fallen over at the point where we've asked the jurisdictions to let us come and conduct the research and collect the data. At that point, they get a bit nervous about the implications of the work. Australia could be better in terms of its attitude to the importance of research and the need for evaluation for accountability purposes.
And is the issue that if a minister has announced a program that they're rolling out in 10 schools to do X, they don't want to see the assessment coming back that says that wasn't effective?
I would be speculating. Ideally, the minister would be saying, we're going to roll this out in 10 schools because we want to see whether it will work, and we are commissioning a really robust independent evaluation to give us that advice.
So it's about framing it pre-announcement as we're trying to learn how to do this better, and making the most of working across the country so that we can actually get some results that make sure that we're using taxpayer money well.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. No more questions from me, Chair. Thanks.
Thank you. Pleasingly, members are covering much of the same terrain. We are honing in on the same issue, so I can discard a number of my questions. But on MTSS, obviously MTSS depends on identifying at-risk students early and reliably. How good are schools currently at this identification step, and what do they need to do to get that right?
Yes, early and reliably, also continually, like not think that they can do it once and know that all of the kids are where they need to be forever and ever, because the circumstances can change for children as they move through their education. Schools vary in terms of their readiness to do this well. The first step is having good access to good screening and diagnostic assessment tools. Most of the systems have on entry to school assessments that are conducted. They're all slightly different, but they're all generally for the same purpose. They would fall short of being diagnostic screening tests themselves, but they would point to students who might need additional screening. So ideally, the students begin school, they'll go through a very light touch, high level kind of assessment with the teacher, which will look at a few things, including predispositions to literacy and numeracy learning, and also other factors to do with their social behaviours, etc. If they don't meet thresholds on some questions, then they're likely to be fed through to another layer of screening, which will give some early information about whether or not they might need additional assistance. But that doesn't happen everywhere, and the screening tools are not prescribed. So you're a little bit at the mercy of whether the school has managed to identify good ones. It is true for some students that they will get as far as year 3 and doing NAPLAN before we find out that they've got a really serious problem in terms of their reading ability, for example. That's better now because of the recent introduction across the country of the phonics check. That's another very early kind of screening opportunity where we can check that students are on track to have the fundamental skills to associate text and sound and have those very early reading skills that they will need. We're doing the same thing over time, putting a numeracy check, making that available across the board. That's part of the current funding agreement for that to happen as well. But the idea that you can just do it once. If you have something very good, it'll give you the information you want, and then hopefully you'll know what to do with it, and you'll know what sorts of interventions to be using at a tier 2, tier 3 stage. But that would not be common to absolutely all schools in all places at the moment.
So on that point, what would be required to implement the multi-tiered systems of support in all schools?
It is an expectation in the current funding agreement that all systems will be looking for ways that they can adopt MTSS in all schools. The difficulty is going to be we don't know a whole lot about how to do that successfully. We did some work early on around MTSS, identified it. Here is the approach that's going to enable you to deliver tiered support, different tailored support to students with additional needs at different points. But the next phase of that research would have been, now let's work with jurisdictions and identify successful ways to implement this. And the enthusiasm for the research dropped away, and we couldn't find a jurisdiction who was interested in letting us in to work with their schools. I think we're actually at a different point again now. Now that MTSS and an expectation is baked into funding agreements, we've got systems coming back to us on a bilateral basis saying, we think we might need some help with this. Aero would love to be able to help. We're designed to do national work that is going to be relevant and important for everybody, but we can provide assistance at a bilateral level as well by arrangement with different jurisdictions. So one option is to look to Aero to help work with them to identify the successful ways for implementation of the approach.
Very good. we're just coming at time. I think we're going to have to call the hearing to an end. Can I apologise again for the technical difficulties that we
I'm
had?
sure it was my fault. I'm renowned for technical deficiencies.
Regardless, I apologise. Thank you for your attendance today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and we'll have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. You'll be advised by the Secretariat of the due date for any questions on notice. Thank you for your presence today. Thank you to members for their presence today. And on that note, I call this hearing to a close. Thank you.
Thank you.